HOA Karen wouldn't stop crossing my lawn. I set a pit trap she didn't see coming. That line still gives me chills every time I say it. But it also sums up the strange, escalating soap opera level saga that turned a calm suburban life into something out of a darkly comic sitcom. When I moved into this neighborhood, I pictured weekend barbecues, mowing in silence, greeting friendly faces on morning walks. Instead, I got a neighbor who treated my front yard like a public footpath, and an HOA that preferred politeness theater over actually solving problems. At first, it was small, a casual step through the grass, a shrug when I mentioned property lines. But as the weeks rolled into months, what I tolerated as an occasional nuisance became a pattern of petty invasions that chipped away at my patience, so much so that I began to obsess over how to reclaim my space without crossing legal or moral lines. The plan I eventually hatched would be clever, non-harmful, and undeniably memorable. 2. Let me paint the picture properly so you understand why I reached for something theatrical instead of a lawyer's letter. Karen, because that's what the whole block called her, half joking, half warning, was a fixture at meetings, a self-appointed guardian of community standards, and someone who loved the sound of her own voice more than the HOA bylaws. She'd parade past my living room window, phone in hand, narrating whatever petty grievance she'd invented that morning. I tried being neighborly, a wave, a smile, asking her politely to use the sidewalk. It didn't work. She moved a decorative iron piece I placed to deter foot traffic. She told my landscaper she had clearance to prune my hedges. Those small invasions were the kind of passive territorial wars that, over time, feel more violating than one big incident. In private, I started documenting everything: dates, times, footage, because proof is the only language HOA boards understand, especially when the board itself is friends with the offender. The HOA complaint process felt like submitting a letter to Hogwarts and waiting for an owl that never came. I filed formal notices, attached images and emails, and explained calmly how she was trespassing and manipulating community policy to suit her convenience. The board replied with a textbook passive-aggressive template. We encourage neighborliness. Please review the community guidelines. Translation: do nothing. Months later, I realized the HOA wasn't going to act unless I made the problem impossible to ignore. I mulled over options: escalate legally, expensive and slow; confront her publicly, messy and likely to backfire, because she knew how to work a crowd; or craft a demonstration that proved the point with irrefutable clarity. I chose the third, not out of malice, but because reason had failed repeatedly, and sometimes people learn better when consequences are visible. 4. I won't sugarcoat the planning phase. It took days. This wasn't about humiliation for the sake of it. It was about designing a non-dangerous, reversible, and unmistakable lesson. I measured, scouted, and sketched. Her path was consistent. Same time in the morning. Same exact line across my lawn near the oak tree. Same little hop over the irrigation line. Predictability is a gift if you're trying to fix a problem creatively. I decided the trap would be a shallow depression, deep enough to startle and embarrass, but lined heavily with soft mulch and padding so there would be zero risk of injury. I covered it with lightweight, biodegradable slats and fresh sod that matched the lawn. The idea was to create a temporary sink that called attention to the trespass without leaving any permanent mark. I also set up a discreet camera angle that captured the route and the moment, so the story wouldn't be he said, she said. On the weekend, I executed the plan. It felt a bit like staging a play where I was both director and audience. I worked methodically, dug carefully to avoid roots, layered padding, camouflaged the top, then took a step back to evaluate how convincingly it blended in. It looked natural, like part of the landscape rather than a set piece. I tested it myself, walking over it to ensure it held slightly, and then gently gave way without causing harm. Safety was non-negotiable. I also made copies of the footage files and backed them up off-site, because I'd learned the hard way that HOA boards can misplace inconvenient videos. That night, I rehearsed what I would say if anyone was hurt, emphasizing my expectation that no one would be injured, and that my goal was to stop trespassing, not to shame somebody into permanent humiliation. Morning arrived, and, like clockwork, Karen made her entrance. She moved across my lawn with the practiced Entitlement of someone who believes rules are. Suggestions for other people. I watched through the blinds, pulse oddly steady, part nervous, part giddy. Then the moment happened. She stepped. The sod gave, and she sank into the shallow pit with a surprised shriek that sounded like someone opening a can of attitude. The coffee she carried sloshed dramatically, a cinematic punctuation to her fall. I opened the door and walked outside slowly, not to gloat, but to be present in case of any real emergency. Her expression was priceless: surprise, indignation, and the dawning realization that her daily shortcut had consequences. She rose quickly, uninjured but furious, teeth clenched like she'd swallowed a lemon. "You trapped me," she hollered. "You trespassed into your own property and fell into your landscaping experiment." I replied calmly. Tone matters. I kept mine flat because rage loses steam when met by an even keel. What happened next could have spiraled. Instead, it exposed the truth. Karen stormed to the HOA board with dirt on her shoes and a dramatically recited story of victimhood. But I had evidence. Hours of footage showing repeated trespasses. Audio of her insisting she had the right to cross. Timestamps aligning with her daily ritual. I sent a composed packet to the board with file links, stills, and a concise timeline. The contrast between her theatrical complaints and the raw footage was stark. The board could no longer hide behind platitudes. There was an admission and repeated trespass documented and timestamped. They issued a violation notice for her behavior, which felt like a small victory for common sense. I also made sure to frame my report as a call for clarity on property boundaries, not revenge, so the HOA wouldn't try to twist the narrative. The aftermath taught me more about human behavior than any HOA meeting ever did. For one, people don't like being publicly shown to be wrong, especially if they've made being superior part of their identity. Karen initially lashed out, trying to rally neighbors by painting herself as the oppressed, community standards champion who'd been ambushed. That strategy crumbled when people watched the video for themselves. Even those who were casual friends of hers admitted privately that she crossed lines. My neighbors started reaching out with their own small confessions. She pruned my roses without asking. Or she told me I couldn't paint my mailbox that color. Suddenly my issue became a mirror, reflecting a larger problem: people mistreating communal norms to fulfill personal control fantasies. 9. There were practical benefits too. The sidewalk traffic cleared. Parents walked their kids the long way without cutting across my yard. Delivery people began to stick to the paved path. I received apologies from a couple of neighbors who had assumed the shortcut was communal. A few even thanked me for taking a stand in a way that forced the HOA to define boundaries clearly. That said, not everything went perfectly. Some neighbors thought my method was childish. Others worried about precedent. What if someone else tried a similar stunt with less benign intent? I understood those concerns, and I responded by being transparent. The pit was temporary, padded, and created solely to deter trespass after all reasonable complaints had failed. I emphasized that the goal was education and boundary enforcement, not humiliation. 10. There's also a legal and ethical angle worth digging into, because, dramatics aside, you should always weigh the consequences before taking matters into your own hands. I consulted a local attorney after the incident, shared the footage, and explained the sequence of events. The lawyer confirmed what I suspected, creating a non-hazardous deterrent. On your private property is typically within your rights if done reasonably, and without intent to cause harm. But they also warned that escalation can get messy quickly if someone is actually injured, or if the HOA decides to rule against creative countermeasures. That legal consultation was a relief and a check on ego. It reminded me that creativity should be bounded by responsibility. Otherwise, a clever lesson can turn into a costly mistake. Over the weeks that followed, the dynamic of the neighborhood shifted subtly. Karen toned down her public pronouncements and stuck to sidewalks like someone who had lost a small but meaningful battle. I found myself invited to a block barbecue, an olive branch I accepted with caution. My relationship with neighbors improved not because of drama, but because the boundaries became clear and enforced. People prefer knowing the rules to walking on eggshells around the loudest person in the room. The whole episode also taught me an important personal lesson. Assertiveness doesn't have to mean aggression. There are ways to be firm, evidence-based and creative without becoming petty. And sometimes, a perfectly harmless but unforgettable demonstration is what it takes to reset expectations. 12. If you take anything away from this rambling suburban saga, let it be this: protect your space, document abuses, and exhaust official channels first. But when those channels fail, be smart about escalation. I don't recommend traps that could injure anyone or any plan born of pure spite. What I did was calculated, legal checked, and designed to educate. The result was a quieter lawn, a reformed shortcut taker, and a community that started to value actual rules over the loudest voice. And yes, I still laugh when I pass the oak tree and remember the theatrical thud of entitlement meeting consequence. If you're dealing with your own HOA Karen, weigh your options, keep evidence. And if you choose to get clever, do it responsibly. Boundary setting can be an art. And in my case, it became a story people still talk about at neighborhood gatherings, preferably with a cup of coffee far from my grass.